Coming up on this episode of the IoT Inc. Business Show.
Now, prognostics focuses much more in its answers on the when. When do I expect a malfunction? When do I reach a critical situation? When should I therefore react? Which, in other words, answers questions or adds a time dimension to diagnostics. Now, prognostics and predictive analytics, they're not Siamese twins. They can go individually from each other.
It seems like predictive analytics is getting all the attention these days. But generally speaking, it requires either a data scientist or a machine learning algorithm operating on lots of event data in order to predict that all-important dimension of time, well, at least to any degree of useful certainty. Enter Prognostic Analytics. In a closed system of uniform conditions, Prognostic Analytics can make better predictions about the when. In this episode of the IoT Business Show, I speak with Moritz von Plate about how the characteristics of this old-school stats makes it very well suited for predictive maintenance in industrial IoT.
All this and more on this episode of the IoT Inc. Business Show. The people, the business, and the technology of the next generation internet. This is the IoT Inc. Business Show. And now, here's your host, Bruce Sinclair.
Hello and welcome to the IoT Inc. Business Show. This show is made possible by sales of my book, IoT Inc., published by McGraw-Hill, and the IoT Inc. Certified IoT Professional, or ICIP, online training and certification program. Become a certified IoT professional by completing the program's 3 courses: ICIP Technology, ICIP Business, and ICIP Strategy and Digital Transformation. Details of which can be found at www.iot-inc.com. That's www.iot-inc.com. With me today on the IoT Show is Moritz von Plate. Moritz is CEO of Cassantec, where he's responsible for strategy, finance, business development, and sales. Moritz started his career as a strategy consultant with BCG and was a CFO at SolarLight, an award-winning solar thermal power plant manufacturer. Moritz, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So,
good morning.
A power plant manufacturer. This is a big product. Did you actually deliver this as a product?
We at SolarLight are, but I'm not with the company anymore, an EPC contractor, so engineering, procurement, construction.
Okay.
The core portion actually was our own product, the parabolic trough, and everything else was purchased on the market.
And then you integrated it all together?
Yes, the typical engineering, procurement, construction scope of building power plants.
Wow. And how long, just out of curiosity, how long does it take to build a power plant, like from start to delivery?
That has a lot of influencing factors. We were a startup, and a startup, of course, took a little bit longer because everything had to be invented and done from scratch.
Wow.
So that took a while longer, but in general, you should be able to do that within a year.
Within a year. And yeah. That's a pretty big product. So you're getting customers were actually buying an entire power plant from a startup.
Which is, it's a contradiction in terms, startup and power plant construction.
Yeah.
And that is, getting over that hump wasn't easy. Being bankable, for example.
Right. Yeah, because I would imagine these costs, what would you say, what are the ranges for cost of something like this?
At that time, we were at about 4,000 euros per megawatt, which is, if you translate that, sorry, not per megawatt, per kilowatt.
Okay.
Yes, if you translate that into a typical, let's say, 10 megawatt power plant, we're talking about something like, 40 million. Of course, with a steep cost regression as we went down the learning curve.
Right.
So we were pretty much looking at below 30 at some point.
Interesting. So I didn't know that's how you that's the business model, I guess, of power plants, right? It's just their size. I guess that makes sense in a way.
Yeah, of course. I mean, we were a bit the odd ones in that business because we were looking at 5 to 10 megawatt power plants, which is, when you look at size of solar thermal power plants, extremely small.
Right.
But from a market perspective, that's a sweet spot.
Now, solar powered, I presume from the name, where were these? They weren't in Germany, or were they?
No, that they would work technically, but just the amount of energy you'd be getting out of them isn't that much.
Yeah.
So we actually built in Thailand. Now, out of all places, the reason for that was that we one of our innovations was to build the parabolic trough made out of composite material, and Thailand, by coincidence, I think, is the world market leader in making surfboards. So they have a lot of knowledge in that field.
Right. So this is how you collect the light and you focus it so you can heat up, I guess, water or something like that?
That was the other innovation. We actually indeed heated up water. Typically, companies use some sort of an oil that doesn't go through a phase change, from liquid to gas, which is technically challenging. And we actually mastered that technical challenge of being able to evaporate water directly in the pipes. And that is a lot more efficient and cheaper if you know how to do it.
Yeah. Well, you've moved on to IoT.
Yes.
I guess why don't you tell us a little bit of your background in IoT and how did you get here from power plants?
I'm the CEO of Cassantec, and that makes me an IoT person. Cassantec is an award-winning pioneer in that field with advanced data analytics based on AI, machine learning, that type of stuff. And I am not. So it's actually math and software, both of which is not my background, but it is math and software.
Perfect for the CEO, then, right?
Exactly, that's how you should be. No, it's math and software applied to industrial assets,
right?
And that's where my reason or right of existence comes into play, because I used to build power plants, and as a consultant, I used to consult to industrial goods companies, and that's why sort of thinking from the perspective of the customer, I was the right guy to do this, because I wasn't the techie who would immediately get lost or get the customer lost in technical details, but rather ask the question, so why do I want this?
Right.
It's cool that it works, but why?
Yeah.
And that's sort of my right of existence within Cassantec, because the founder and inventor of the whole thing, he's the technical geek.
Sure.
He's been doing the research for decades and all that kind of stuff. And so I'm sort of translating him into stuff that people can actually buy.
So that's why we have you on the show and not him, then, I'm guessing.
He'd be great on the show as well, so no doubt about that. He's awesome.
Good answer.
But,
good answer. Founder, CEO relationship. I know it well, so very good answer there.
No, it's actually interesting. We are yin and yang in many ways, but
Excellent.
He's introvert, I'm extrovert, and so on and so forth. But the chemistry must be right, and the chemistry does work extremely well.
No, but you're lucky, because it can be pure hell if it doesn't.
Yes.
I can speak from experience. Now, you're physically based where?
We're a modern company. Most of the company, including myself, is actually based in Berlin, which is, as you might know, really a humming tech scene, while Frank is based out of Zurich, which is, Switzerland being one of the top 3 innovative countries in the world. We kind of tap into the 2 most interesting markets in that sense when you're looking at least Europe.
But most of you are based in Germany now. Now I know, there's a thriving tech scene there, and in fact, I was there almost a year ago, or a little bit more than a year ago, for an IoT show. How is the IoT scene there? Is it also? I was just there for a conference. I was speaking at a conference there, but how is it just in general for IoT?
We are. It's not. Let's say it that way. It's not quite as crazy and thriving as the more consumer-focused type things, which is really big in Berlin. But we have a number of good universities, and so we have a number of good startups coming out of that. And we're actually here sitting in a sort of a tech hub, where really a number of good companies are located. Generally, though, Germany is spread out, so you're going to find good companies in places you wouldn't expect them to be.
Yeah, that's nice, to try to spread things out. I know that's one of the things, at least in the U.S., where there's such a concentration on both sides of the coast and then particular places within. But to spread it out makes a lot of difference, just in terms of you've got, like you were mentioning, universities, just workforce, and there's a lot of advantages to do that.
There's pros and cons, of course. If you have concentration, you have, of course, also concentration of capabilities, of experience, and so on. If you spread that out, but at the same time, Germany is a tiny country, so if I want to go to the other places, it's a 1 hour flight max, and that's it.
Yeah, that's true. Well, why don't we dig into it? Our common friend Ilya, he pointed me in your direction. Actually, he was one of the reviewers of one of the chapters in my book, and he brought to my attention Prognostic Analytics, and in particular, what I want to talk. Well, let's start there. Why don't you give us a background, or just tell us what is Prognostic Analytics, and give us a bit of history on it.
Well, let's start more like not with a history, but with a story. Take out and just make a story out of it. There is a lot of talk about data analytics nowadays.
Yes,
and that's because we have the data now at our fingertips and the computing power to do something with it. And that's why everybody is engaging in analyzing data. And why? Obviously, because we want to know something about the future. We want to learn from the past to be better prepared for the future. Mm-hmm. And in that context, your fellow countryman Wayne Gretzky has a great quote. A good hockey player plays where the puck is. A great hockey player plays or skates where the puck is going to be.
Right.
Now, the quote is well known. What's actually behind that are two interesting concepts. One is pattern recognition or data analytics to understand what's going to happen next. He pretty much has a data analytical engine in his brain intuitively that understands patterns and identifies what's going to happen next. That's concept number one. Concept number two, and that's usually forgotten. Mm-hmm. It's about probabilities. So in his long career, he's going to have skated in the wrong direction a lot of times. Mm-hmm. But probabilistically, he's going to have skated in the right direction more often than everybody else. And that's because he understood the probabilities behind the data patterns he's looking at. And that is pretty much also what we're seeing in industrial contexts, which is we need to somehow analyze data to glean insight about the future and need to understand that that's actually under uncertainty / probabilities.
Right.
So more specifically, everybody's sort of trying to get as accurate within that area of uncertainty about the future as possible. Now, there are a lot of different use cases for data analytics, of course. Prognostics, how we see it, is, of course, something where we're talking about something having a deterioration, for example, which we need to understand and prognosticate based on data. That thing could be an industrial asset like a turbine or a pebble crusher or I don't know what. Mm-hmm. It could be a car. It could just as well be your heart, having some sort of a wear and tear type of development.
But I do. Okay, go ahead.
And with data analytics methodologies, we want to reach as good a foresight perspective on that component as possible. And that's why somebody from GE Predicts recently said to me, or wrote to me, prognostics is the holy grail. So, of course, the holy grail meaning this is really what everybody wants to reach, but at the same time, it's what we are striving for without ever really reaching the perfect end state. Mm-hmm. And I think prognostics is a bit like a promise, and a promise that we're probably delivering on better than anybody else. But that's sort of the idea behind that. Now, there are the term itself. There are actually ISO norms and DIN definitions for the term, but honestly, I find them not very helpful. So that means people are actually using this term, using the word prognostics, but it's used in a very interchangeable way. It's used in a very inaccurate way because the definitions of these norms are actually, you can throw them away, in my opinion. They're not very helpful.
So what are the definitions, just to help everyone out that's listening? And then I think where you're going to go is you're going to give us a better one, hopefully.
I forgot the DIN, the German norm is in German, so I'm not going to repeat that. The ISO norm
okay.
is actually relatively long and describes perfectly what I would summarize as predictive analytics.
Okay, yeah.
It, in my opinion, doesn't describe prognostics,
right.
which is quite interesting. But I think we're going to get there in our discussion about the differences between the two. Yeah. Now, prognostics for me is giving a perspective or an insight or foresight onto what is going to happen when and with which probability. And so what's really relevant here is not only what and probability, but also when. Meaning, I don't only give early warnings, I actually say in 3 weeks, you're going to have a bearing defect with 30% likelihood. In 4 weeks, it's 35% likelihood. In 5 weeks, it's X%. So this is what actually, in my definition of the term, is only delivered by prognostics and no other solution.
Yeah, and I think, for everyone listening, Moritz kind of broke it down in a nice way in 2 parts, and I think, and we're going to talk about predictive analytics. We're going to talk about prognostics, and we're going to talk about prescriptive analytics. But I like the way you're breaking it down into 2 parts. First part, pattern recognition. So I like thinking of it like a signature. And after you've built up enough data over time, you build up a failure signature, for example, and then you do a pattern recognition and you try to say, well, is my current data looking like this failure signature? But then the second part I think is key, and I think this is where we're going to drill down. It's going to be a geeky one, everyone, so just get ready. But I think this is where we're going to drill down. Is the next part is going to be the probability of that event happening, okay? But I think what you're saying, the distinction here with prognostic analytics, and it does have a long history. I mean, a lot longer history than predictive analytics. But the distinction here is that there's a lot of events that you're trying to predict. An event has a lot of characteristics, but the one that prognostic analytics is trying to calculate or predict is time, right? The time dimension. And would you say that's the biggest difference between prognostic analytics and, say, predictive analytics, and then we'll get to prescriptive analytics later?
From the output perspective, yes, that's the big difference. Let me quote somebody from GE. He wrote an article recently, which is GE Smart Signal, which is their predictive analytics engine, is often classified in the equipment reliability world, I'm now quoting, by the way, as a predictive analytic product. However, similar to other technologies in the space, it doesn't predict the future. It basically finds deterioration in equipment performance well before it's obvious. In other words, predictive analytics is about saying something will happen in the future, and we find that for you in the here and now. But it doesn't give you the information about when it will happen. And for a decision maker, that's pretty important, because if he gets an early warning, his question is, or her, of course, do I need to panic now, drop my coffee mug and get the thing repaired? Do I have a week to prepare? Do I even have 3 months to observe? And predictive analytics doesn't help with that question. And that's a central question, of course, when it comes to decision making.
Yeah. No, predictive analytics will do a very good job of identifying perhaps what's going to break down. But I guess, this is a little bit confusing for me, because then maybe it's just definitions. But my understanding is it will tell you roughly when. And is it just a matter of a degree of accuracy that we're talking about? Because if you say it's going to happen in the future, well, that is a time prediction. It's just a very low resolution one. If you say it's going to right, if you say it's going to happen within a year, that's also a prediction, but it's a little more accurate, but it's lower resolution. So, are we talking about differences in the resolution of the prediction of time? Or are we completely talking about 2 different things?
No, if you phrase it like that, then it's actually a matter of resolution. But of course, the resolution sometime in the future is so rough that it doesn't really help you in making a decision. whether you need to react now or not. I'll give you an example. I recently spoke to a customer, and he's operating compressors that's feed a reaction column, a chemical reaction column. And the most expensive event for them is to have to start that up again. So they want to avoid startup procedures. And he says, now I get a warning from my condition monitoring that says this compressor is getting sketchy. The big question now is, will it live for the next 3 weeks until I've got my scheduled outage or not? And Predictive Analytics doesn't help with that question, because it just tells you, yeah, it is getting sketchy. But
it's telling you that in the next time you better do something about it. But what you're saying is you're not sure that it'll make it until the next scheduled maintenance then.
And so he needs prognostic information to be able to find out whether the compressor is probably going to make it until then. B, what's the risk associated with that? C, can I, for example, go into a different operating scenario where I prolong the useful life of that compressor that I actually make it? Those types of analyses and question scenarios cannot be... Predictive Analytics provides sort of initial hypotheses, but the prognosis behind that needs to be done by an expert. And that's not data analytical, that's people.
So you're saying that prediction then can still happen, but it requires a human to be interpreting the data that's been kind of massaged in a different way for them to look at? Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay. And so that's where the time, because that's what I think maybe, I'm sure if I'm confused, there's probably others as well, because, yeah, that was my understanding, and I've seen it in action, and there has been times been predicted. But what you're saying, I guess, and this is a nuance here, I think what you're saying is, it really requires the data scientist to make that estimation as opposed to the machine code.
It is a nuance, but a really important one, because I know, I'm not sure it's a verbal quote, but you might know Daniel Kahneman. He is a Nobel laureate and in economics, and he did a lot of research on expert predictions, and he comes to the conclusion expert predictions are at best inconsistent, typically wrong. If you have an algorithm with an R-square of 20 or 30%, use it, it's got to be better than the expert. And he's pretty rough in that assessment. By the way, that's from his book Thinking Fast and Slow, which in my opinion is a must-read for everybody.
Yes.
But what's behind that is experts don't know where their knowledge ends and where speculation begins. On top of that, they're driven by emotions. You know, we all are. And again, last one is the human is a storyteller. If he's got 2 data points, he's going to make a story around that to make the 2 data points match. That's normal. I can give you a plethora of examples. And so having the expert make those prognostic assessments based on the predictive analytics puts them right smack into the area where we have the problems, which is the human making the prediction, not the machine.
Right. Okay.
Of course,
I like that.
Now the Silicon Valley types are going to say, "Hey, wait a minute, we have got deep learning. We can throw our algorithms, our big data algorithms against that, and they're going to come up with the results." Yes, that might be true for Amazon, because if you log on to Amazon.com, you're going to generate an event, which is either you buy or you leave the website, which both are events, and then you have tons of events against which to optimize your predictive algorithms, your deep learning algorithms. Now, in the industrial arena, everything we want to avoid and everything we do to avoid is events, because an event is a damage. So how many times are you going to run your turbine to failure? Well, if you're stupid, 5 times a year. But 5 events don't make a good basis for any type of statistical analysis or stochastic analysis. And that's why you can't go with deep learning algorithms. You need to come up with other solutions like Cassantec prognostics.
So, just to maybe just parrot back what you're saying for everybody, what you're saying is, yeah, we can take predictive analytics to the point where we can make a pretty good estimate of time with machine, not just human, if we have a lot of data points. And what you're saying is in the industrial or the commercial or maybe the infrastructure side of things, where you don't really want to have a lot of these data points, then with a limited data set, not a lot of samples, with a limited data set, you're not going to be able to make a very good prediction even with these machine learning type algorithms. Am I paraphrasing you correctly?
Yes.
Yeah. And I think that is a big, I think just looking at it at a basic level, when you're doing statistics and then when you're doing probability, two different things done in two different ways here. In both cases, the quality is going to be based on the samples. It's going to be based on the model that you can develop. And everyone who's listened to me or written or read anything I've written, I'm all about the model. That's where all the value is creating a great model. But the point that you're bringing up here is that to be able to create a great model, you need a lot of samples, and that's something that's generally not happening in let's say, the manufacturing space, right?
Yes, exactly.
So, I think you could generalize this now with one customer. We'll say with one turbine. If they have 5 mistakes in 1 year, that's pretty bad, and it's also a pretty small sample. But if it's a manufacturer, that has all their turbines in all their customers instrumented, and they're able to collect this data, then we start getting a bigger sample size, right? Specifically as the dimension of time marches on. So still, you're saying in that scenario, there isn't enough to make a good predictive model or to develop a model?
Yes and no. There are definitely areas where such predictive models are available and feasible. Mm-hmm. But just take the turbine manufacturer. Number one, he usually doesn't have the information about the malfunctions to the level of detail he needs that to make decisions, because the operator is going to try to shield his this information away, because we're talking also about warranties and about who pays for the damage and so on. So that's number one. Number two, different operators, different circumstances, different events. Just from the operational standpoint, also from a definitional standpoint, an event is not always a damage, where something breaks. It could also be an inefficiency, but an inefficiency is something different for different people. And so making these events comparable with different types of data, it is tough. So yes, there are niches where this is feasible, but just imagine you are an OEM. You've built the turbine. And now you're being tasked with providing prognostic information beyond just the turbine. Mm-hmm. Well, then you're back in the woods, because you need to now suddenly get information from equipment that you've never built, that you've never seen. So making this, and then you're starting piecemeal, stitching together to individual solutions. And in some cases, you've got prognostic information. In most cases, you don't. And at the end of the day, you're going to have a crazy mix of solutions and white gaps and so on. And it's just not, it's not practical. B, in many cases, you simply don't have any results because of the initially mentioned points. And so C, as a result, the user of the solutions is going to despair.
Well, I think, Moritz, what you're kind of describing is a playbook for an OEM to do it right. I mean, you're saying make sure right?
Yes, strategically, I'm always saying the OEMs are the ones that are really at risk from this entire industrial internet, because they used to make hardware and have a very profitable service model. And now that's being put at risk, because just imagine some IT company comes there and puts itself between the OEM and the operator as a sort of a sanitary film that does the data analytics. Who is the operator going to do the asset strategy with? That's then the guy who knows the data, and not the OEM anymore. And the OEM is out of a business. So all the OEMs are working very hard in cannibalizing their own business model, which makes it hard for them as well, because they need to cannibalize their service model. But that's a defensive move, which, of course, they can make into an offensive move. But they're being attacked by the IBMs and SAPs of this world. Latest count, there are more than 400 IoT platforms out there, all fighting for access to these assets. That's what the battle we're seeing. And we take the simple stance of saying we are the ones who do the data analytics, and whether we're sitting on the IT company's IoT platform or the OEM's IoT platform, I don't care.
Yeah. No, but I think what you're saying is that if you are an OEM, and I think you're recognizing this, that you have to cannibalize your business. But the playbook that I'm referring to is make sure that you do instrument all your products. Make sure that you instrument them in such a way that the data sets can be correlated, because they will be in different environments. But if you can measure those environments, then you can correlate those data sets together and make sure so you need to do this. So for all those OEMs that are listening to us right now, you need to do this so you don't have, I like that sanitary film between your product and the customer, because you don't want to have any film between you and your customer, right? And you want to be able to do it yourself. And it doesn't mean that they're not going to use a platform. They quite possibly are going to use, and I would recommend, in fact, that they use a platform themselves. But I just see, it's kind of interesting, because what you're talking about, I think, is looking at it at the state of the industry today. Now, maybe in 10 years, if these lessons are learned, we'll have more of this good data and we'll be able to do, better things with it. And so it's just interesting hearing you say it this way, because I see it as being advice for OEMs and how they should be looking forward and developing their new version of that turbine, so to speak, if you know what I mean.
At the same time, advice for the IT companies is if they go into the attacking mode and want to build IoT platforms, they are lacking the domain knowledge that the OEM has got. And so their service offering is going to be a mere database, as long as they don't link that up with a good domain-specific analytics solutions and tools. Just having a very performant IoT platform solution that is extremely capable of gathering and compiling and I don't know what data, then, essentially you're nothing else but a database.
Yes. And I think, that is a lesson. My opinion and my view is that every industry is going to consolidate, and they're going to consolidate to 1, 2, or 3 platforms. But that consolidation is going to happen in a couple of ways. It's going to happen being based on domain knowledge, like you're saying. I think there's going to be parts of platforms, and this is simply the collection part, will eventually be commoditized to the point where it's independent, more or less, of industry. There may be a few nuances, but it's going to be the brain, it's going to be the model, the application, and the analytics. That's the trinity of value in my speak. That will be very unique on an industry-by-industry basis, and that's where your advice to the platform manufacturers are, that if you don't want to be commoditized, and I may be rephrasing what you're saying, in a different way, but if you don't want to be commoditized, you need to have domain knowledge, which means you need to work with, a partner in that particular space. Does that sound about right to you?
Yes, I agree with you. Although I'm not that certain that we're going to have the same type of consolidation that we've seen in the consumer market. The iTunes versus Google Play versus what's the name of the Microsoft store? Forgot. Yes. I'm not. I don't think it's going to be such an oligopoly, because we're talking about physical assets, so it's not quite as easy, and we're talking about legacy systems that need to be integrated.
Yeah, no, I think we're saying the same thing. I think we'll see that happening on a vertical by vertical basis.
Okay.
Which means you'll have a lot of them. Now, the size of the vertical, I guess, is the question of debate.
And there's a few cross-vertical plays, but probably not that many. Okay, I got it.
Yeah, except for the collection part, right? I think on the collection side of things, so if you're just the plumbing, what I refer to as the plumbing, where you're moving the data from the data source, whether that is going to be a sensor or that's going to be a microservice on the internet, to the point of developing your model, and that'll be in the analytics or in the application. I can see, right? I can see that being very much commoditized and being very similar, independent of the physical environment it's in. But but the model, the analytics, and the application, you can't, right? And that's going to be, and so each of the 300 or so 400 platforms that are out there, I agree with you that they need to, and this is advice from us, just two of us on this interview, but they need to focus on an industry by industry basis because they're not going to be able to survive otherwise.
And here comes the interesting and hard part. How do you make that scalable then? If you are too asset specific, and predictive analytics sort of leans towards being relatively asset specific, then you have a problem with scalability, with changes in, for example, physical hardware, and so you need to find the right sweet spot between being very specific, and at the same time being agnostic enough that you actually can deal with changes in the physical environment with scalability in general.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to the point of how wide that industry vertical is, in the sense that if it's very, very thin, then the question is it viable? But you're saying that, you can't be too thin. But I think this is, let's go back to prognostic analytics, predictive analytics, and prescriptive analytics, which we haven't talked about yet.
True. Mm-hmm.
And I guess I'll just sort of park the question I was going to ask, but can you maybe just give us one sentence on each of the three, and then I'm going to ask you about effectively what you just said in terms of the specific use cases. So maybe give us a definition of the three, in from your point of view, and then where are they best used? Maybe what are the use cases that each of the three, what are their sweet spots?
Okay.
Would you be able to take us through that?
I don't know if I'm able to, but so it's going to be my a few cents worth. But anyhow, predictive analytics is, in my perspective, a very accurate diagnostic tool set that helps you understand or answer the questions of what, why, where, how of an asset in its current condition. It becomes predictive because that is so accurate that you can actually identify data anomalies before you're moving into a malfunction.
Right.
So it is actually, if you will, a very accurate sort of next generation condition monitoring, automatic condition monitoring. Now, prognostics focuses much more in its answers on the when. When do I expect a malfunction? When do I reach a critical situation? When should I therefore react? Which, in other words, answers questions or adds a time dimension to diagnostics. Now, prognostics and predictive analytics, they're not Siamese twins. They can go individually from each other. Actually, in our personal, Cassantec's applications, we usually don't see predictive analytics being installed, but they could be Siamese twins because they have a slightly different angle, like I explained earlier. Now, prescriptive analytics, I understand it as being sort of, what do you do with the insight and foresight? Meaning, it is an approach to prescribing actions. And in other words, it doesn't just give information to a decision maker, but actually beyond that tells the decision maker what to do to a certain level of detail.
Right.
Now, I believe that prescriptive analytics is at best at its very early development stage, because the world is fiendishly complex. So let me be slightly facetious. I can imagine how prescriptive analytics can tell you how many bananas to stock in a supermarket. But if it comes to the question of how do I deal with the impending bearing defect on my pump, then I am cautious to assume that we've got prescriptive analytic solutions in the market that work. Because the root cause for that bearing defect there can be a lot of different root causes.
So
Beyond
you're saying
the possible course of action is very much driven by a lot of other circumstances, like your current financial position, availability of people, availability of spare parts, your planned maintenance actions. So there are a lot of inputs into that decision. And hardwiring them into a analytical solution that then prescribes action, I think that's going to be tough. I believe it's going to come eventually, probably in the shape and format like Amazon's users who've bought this book have also bought the following thing. Translate that into the asset world. Operators who've seen this type of problem have typically responded in the following way. But that's a long way off. But that's still not,
and I would even argue that's maybe not even prescriptive at that point, right? It's more guidance, but it's not. I mean, I like to look at it, and I think if you look at prognostic, predictive, and prescriptive, they're kind of going in time, right? Prognostic is the older one, predictive is the newer one, and prescriptive is brand new, kind of like what you're saying. And I kind of like maybe a way we can look at this is, when is something going to happen? With prognostic, what's going to happen with predictive, and what should happen with prescriptive, right? That's kind of, if you squint your eyes, that's a good way of looking at it. But like you say, prescriptive is still in its infancy, but it does have a lot of potential, right? But what makes things even more complicated, you were talking about the Siamese twins and how they can work together. They are all solving slightly different problems, but mathematically they're doing them in very different ways. Is
very
that
different ways. Yes, but before we go into the math, maybe one quick metaphor that helps. Mm-hmm. I view at least our prognostic solution like the Mr. Spock on the commando bridge of the Enterprise. Okay. Giving this fact-based, unemotional advice to Captain Kirk, who's the decision maker at the end of the day. Mm-hmm. And Captain Kirk is of course the operator. So if a perfect prescriptive analytics solution were there, we could get rid of Captain Kirk, right? Because then Mr. Spock would be flying the Enterprise himself. But honestly, I think we're still very far away from that. We need the Captain Kirks, and Captain Kirk needs the Mr. Spocks to lift the entire decision making to a new level of quality.
Yeah, no, I can believe that, and I think then bringing into what we're talking about here is that we need these data science tools and we need the data scientists, right? I mean, I think they both work together.
Actually, I go beyond that. You're talking about the data scientist being the Mr. Captain Kirk. For me, it's not the data scientist. It's actually the decision maker in the plant. It's the guy operating the pump, who needs the data scientific solution to provide information to him for better decision making. Yeah, that's how I see it.
Yeah, no, and I think, and I do agree, and I think just to dive in this, Mr. Spock is still needed today. Maybe in the future, Mr. Spock will not be needed, that being the data scientist, but he's still needed today. Or is prognostic? You're saying you're eliminating the Mr. Spock from the whole situation.
No, we are the Mr. Spock. Our prognostic solution is the Mr. Spock.
You're a machine version. You're not Mr. Spock. You're a
machine version of Mr. Spock.
Yeah. What was his? That was the machine, Mr. Spock in the Next Generation. Not to be too geeky.
And then the question, of course, is whether we're going to replace Captain Kirk or not. And that would be prescriptive analytics. And I am cautious with that. Actually, I believe that is literally decades away. People might have a different opinion, but looking at the rate of adoption, the rate of development in technologies around predictive analytics and prognostics, if you extrapolate that, now, of course, I know extrapolation is always risky, but let's extrapolate for a moment, then true prescriptive analytics is still quite a while away.
Yeah, no,
don't hold your breath. It's not going to be worth it.
All right, let's come down from the Enterprise and get on Earth, and give us, tell us, what are the use cases? So even though you brought up one, the bananas on the shelf, and maybe that's your use case for prescriptive, but give us some use cases where prognostic analytics works best, where predictive analytics works best, and where prescriptive analytics works best.
Now, let's sort of move prescriptive analytics out of the way. In the long run, it's going to work best everywhere. Right now, what we've got right now is for sort of high frequency, sort of more transactional decision making.
Where there's lots of data.
Yeah, there's lots of data. There you need to have quick decisions, but the complexity in each decision is relatively low.
Okay.
That's that. Then predictive analytics for me is it's a bit of a nasty way of saying it, but I like to exaggerate it a little bit to make things as clear as possible. Mm-hmm. So for me, predictive analytics is actually a modern automatic condition monitoring system where you use that in real time to identify deteriorations in your equipment and make sure that your equipment isn't going to fail on you, and also identify at least hypotheses towards the root causes.
Okay.
Now, and that's why, everybody nowadays should have, in my opinion, proper automatic condition monitoring on their mission critical components. And now, enhancing that, upgrading that to predictive analytics does make sense to a certain degree, possibly. Now, prognostics has its use case when it comes to decisions that look further into the future. And we're talking about rather weeks, months, and years than hours and few days. And there are a lot of use cases around that. For example, I gave you an example earlier on the compressor that's developing a problem. Will it live until the next scheduled outage? Or a customer that wants to do a complete plant refurbishment in 2 years. Will my components actually make it until then? And if no, what can I do about that? I have the OEM says every 1 year do a minor revision with the following scope, and every 5 years do a major revision with the following scope. That is usually costly. So can I start playing with scope and timing of my revisions? Can I possibly postpone the revisions by a few weeks? That's huge money if you calculate that up. But what's the risk behind those extensions of time? So in essence, prognostics is about identifying the bad apples and managing the resulting unscheduled outages out of the system, and at the same time running or utilizing the remaining useful life of your equipment optimally. That is, how do I say that? It's about asset management. It's about reducing costs from your entire asset strategy through getting better long-term future information.
Yeah, no, and I hear what you're saying, and I'd also say that from the limited knowledge that I have on prognostic analytics, you brought up the term, and we're circling around this, but it is very well suited, and I think that's what I was kind of more trying to get at from the use case. But very well suited to engineering systems that are closed systems that are very describable. Is that a fair assessment? As opposed to the newer, the more flamboyant predictive analytics that can work on more open systems that have a lot more unknowns, as opposed to a constrained system. And I think that's useful for everyone listening. And correct me if I'm wrong, Moritz, but if you've got an environment that's you've got enough variables and constants, and you can solve the equation, meaning it's closed system, and you know all the parts, then prognostics will work theoretically for you. However, if it is not that type of system, then prognostic isn't necessarily the right fit. And that's what I'm kind of trying to tease out here is when should we be using one versus the other?
Okay, from that perspective, prognostics works for the mission critical components in a plant that generate enough condition and process data and are typically run continuously. So if we're talking about a power plant, we're talking about the feed water pump, the steam turbine, the generator, the transformer, the FD fans, the forced draft fan, the induced draft fan, the steam boiler, those types of main components, which, like you say, they're to a certain degree they're closed systems, and they're relatively well understood when it comes to what type of malfunctions can you expect on those. You might not have had a history of malfunctions, but from a at least theoretical understanding, what could go wrong with these components, and therefore what type of data I need to monitor the systems. So that's at a power plant, and we could say the same thing about a steel plant, about a chemical plant, paper mill, about a processing plant, in a mine, in a car, in a train, etc. pp. So that's where prognostics is applicable. Where it becomes tough to apply prognostics is, for example, when you have a lot of influencing factors, influencing variables that you cannot control. Give you an example. If you have a machine tool, and the machine tool that's, for example, milling something, and you change your tool, and the product every other minute, then you're going to have a lot of different influencing factors on your data coming actually not from the wear and tear on the machine tool, but rather from simply a different tool and a different product with a different alloy. And then the variability in the data is going to be so big that modeling it in such a way that prognostics is applicable will be theoretically possible, but practically completely futile.
And I could maybe throw in there the human component. Would you agree? I mean,
yes,
having
of course.
the human involved makes it very difficult for a prognostic kind of modeling as you're talking. I thought about saying it, kind of went to the machine tools, but of course, what prognostics will never cover is human error. If you forget the wrench in the pump after the last repair, that is completely not prognosticated. You can't prognosticate that. Yeah. No, and I think closed versus an open system maybe it's not extremely accurate, but I think it is a good way to maybe think about it. Yeah. All right. Well, this has been, we deep dived into this, and I think it's real important because right now all the buzz, everything you hear about is on predictive analytics. You're hearing a little bit about prescriptive analytics, but it's all predictive analytics. You don't hear very much about prognostic analytics, so I think this has been very helpful for everyone, listening to understand it. And I think, if you were to conclude on it, maybe, if you have a closed system, such as in a plant where humans are not necessarily involved, and you've got lots of data and it's repetitive and we're not changing, the variables aren't changing, then there's tools specifically around prognostic analytics that can actually give you that magical dimension of time, when something going to happen. Is that a good way to sum it, for prognostic analytics?
Yes. Thank you.
All right. All right. Well, I'm just making sure I understand it as well.
Yeah, sure.
All right. Moritz, can you tell us a little bit more about your company and where people can find out more about your product, your prognostic analytics product?
Yes. So our name is Cassantec. It is spelled Cassantec. That's short for Cassandra Technologies. Cassandra, following the Greek mythology of that woman from Troy who could foresee events, and she was always right. Now, of course, people didn't believe her. She was cursed. So that's a bit of a challenge for us, but we didn't want to call ourselves after her twin brother Helenos, who everybody believed, but nobody knows him. So being Cassandra Technologies is a bit more fun, and it's a good basis for a discussion. So you can find us, of course, on the web, www.cassantec.com. We have a small blog there, some information. It's a very old school website with a lot of text, with a lot of information. So if you really want to get information, you can go to the website. That's probably the best way. And of course, even better is reaching out to me directly. You can find me on LinkedIn. You can find me, of course, through the website, etc. I'm always approachable.
All right. Well, everyone, as you know, we'll put this all in the show analysis notes. You don't have to write this down. It'll all be there. And and then we'll also include your LinkedIn profile too, Moritz. I appreciate your time. I appreciate the clarification, and we'll talk soon.
Same here. Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Okay. That was a good talk with Moritz von Plate. This podcast goes vertical, deep diving into different topics each week. If you prefer a more horizontal and structured approach to learning IoT business and its orbiting technologies, check out my book IoT Inc., published by McGraw-Hill, or become a certified IoT professional by completing the ICIP training and certification program. For details, just go to www.iot-inc.com. Also go to www.iot-inc.com for an analysis of this episode, links to things that were mentioned during the episode, and very importantly, the episode's PDF transcript. Just search for the name of the episode or the guest. If you're new to this podcast, subscribe. That way you'll get every week's episode delivered straight to your device. Or, if you've been listening for a while, there are 3 ways you can support the show. You can leave a rating or a review on iTunes. Just go to iot-inc.com/iTunes. It only takes 1 click to leave a rating, a little bit longer to leave a review. You can share it on social. I'm on LinkedIn, to a lesser extent on Twitter. And of course, you can support the show by buying my book, IoT Inc., or the ICIP training and certification program. It's how I pay the bills. Next week's episode is Hot Rods and IoT Databases Tuned for Analytics with Nick Ronda. I hope you can join me then. I'm your host, Bruce Sinclair. Thank you for listening. Until next week, may your path to IoT business be a predictable one.
You have been listening to the IoT Inc. Business Show.